contrary to what they both think, I think I actually do need an introduction. Because, to me, I consider myself an artist and a designer, and I'm a behind-the-scenes person. I'm not a rapper, and I just really, these days, try to be an advocate for visual artists that don't get enough credit. And as much as I love the whole concept of hip-hop, when young people hear the words hip-hop today, a lot of people just think music. And for me, being a visual artist, I've been doing what I've been doing at the same time as a lot of the first generation rappers. And it's important for people to understand that it really is a culture. It's a four-legged table. If you take one leg off that table, it's not going to stand up. And nobody can decide what's more important between rap music, DJing, breakdancing, or graffiti, or what have you. And there's even speculation about what the four elements are. But the truth of the matter is, it almost doesn't matter as long as you are a fan of some aspect of it. That's what really matters to me. And I just think that it's important to think about the culture outside of the A-list superstars that get a lot of attention today. And I don't really want to name names because a lot of these people are my friends. But I just, and they will be the first to acknowledge that, they were inspired by a lot of the same things that we're talking about. Everybody's got a hero. And when you sit people down and you ask them, they say, oh, I didn't know that. So I'm the kind of person, I want to talk about those things because I don't want a 10-year-old kid to be confused about how we got to where we are today. So we'll just start there. Anyway, like Ron said, my name is Cey Adams, and I came up really in the, for sake of argument, the late 70s, really the golden era of hip-hop. Well, it's really probably more like the mid-80s, but anyway. And I started out as a graffiti artist when I was a teenager. And my whole goal was to try to figure out a way to communicate to the world that I exist. And I went out and I painted subway trains and ran around in the street with my little graffiti crew trying to make a name for myself. And that was really how a lot of things started for me.
The Public Animals?
Yeah, TPA. I didn't know that. Even that, like the idea that we had this little graffiti crew that consisted of myself, my two brothers, and three other guys. There was 6 of us. And some 30-odd years later, there are local graffiti guys here in this community that know of that crew. And it's just amazing how time just, evolves. And it's just something that's really strange to me, but cool all at the same time. So I'm going to give you back the mic so you can ask me a few questions, and then we'll just get into
it. Has anybody seen the movie Style Wars? All right. Style Wars, he was actually had a brief moment in the Style Wars movie, is that correct?
Well, it's funny. You can even just tilt it back over. The only reason it was brief is because I didn't know that they were making a movie. It was just a camera on myself and another friend of mine, Ernie Valles, while we were talking at a gallery opening. So it could have easily have been when you and I were over there in that corner talking and the camera's just there. If you'd known that was going to be something important, you might have said a little bit more, or you might make sure it was funnier, or whatever it is. I was an 18-year-old kid. What did I know?
Was it you and the Drama King? No, Kay Slay was in there too, right?
There's a lot of people in there, but again, it was a simpler time, and this was also a time when adults didn't really care about what we were doing. This was just something that we were doing for ourselves. Even as I mentioned, it being in the context of a gallery, the larger context of the film was about graffiti on subways and how we were trying to make a mark in spite of the city trying to, quote-unquote, hold us back.
The city's always going to hold you back. I mean, that's the way it is. So from there, you had a chance encounter with a guy named Russell Simmons. Russell Simmons, would you say he put you on?
No, not really. If anything, over the years, I've started to think about that relationship in a very different way. I think that it was just as important that he met me as me meeting him, because things could have went in a bunch of different directions. Def Jam might not be the label that it is today without the visual work that myself and my team did. So, today I'm going to say, you know what, it was mutually beneficial for us all. And we really should throw Rick Rubin's name in there as well, because he was there as well, even though my relationship with Russell sort of predates Rick. But as it relates to the Def Jam years, they were both there together.
Yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because Russell did put a lot of people on, so to speak. But when you're meeting somebody who is just young and finding their wheels, that's what basically at this time Russell was, and you kind of were able to bring whatever visions he had in his head. You were actually able to manifest those visions.
Well, the interesting thing is he didn't really.
He didn't have any vision.
Well,
he had visions of supermodels.
You know what? When you're doing visual art, this was a lane that I had all to myself. Nobody got in the way when it came to me doing what it is that I do visually. I meet Russell like 1983. I'm a graffiti artist trying to transition out of that life and do something quote unquote more professional and legal with my artwork. And I meet Russell, I go down to his office. He's got a small office, 2 employees. This is not a life-altering moment. And as all of you know, you meet people every day. You never know who's going to be the person that's going to change your life, or, a life that you'll change by them meeting you. And so I meet Russell, and it really is just one day. And we just start talking, and I mentioned that I was an artist, and I got his business card from a photographer friend, and I basically just, made myself available to the opportunities in his office, and whatever needed to get done visually, I did it. Whether it was designing flyers, t-shirts, posters, anything that had some sort of visual element, I created that.
I want to ask you, before all this happened, what were the some of the artists and illustrators and whatnot that you looked up to?
Well, I am naturally a fan of comic book art, so a lot of the folks that you mentioned were people that I loved growing up as well. But, I'm a kid of, I grew up during the pop art era, so I was always a fan of Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein and Jasper Johns and folks like that. And people like Romare Bearden, Jacob Lawrence. So pop art was something that spoke to me because, not that it was simpler, but it was something that was a little bit more familiar as opposed to, a lot of the traditional sort of European painting style that you had to have a PhD to stand in front of. Pop art was something that spoke to me as a kid.
I agree. I was heavily influenced by comic books growing up as well. When you started working and doing stuff with the Def Jam family and creating that whole the brand, basically, did you design the logo as well, or in the record sleeves? Or who did that?
Rick Rubin designed that.
Did he really?
Yeah.
He's a pretty creative fellow.
Very creative.
I would definitely agree. For a time, I understand that you actually, you were definitely with the Beasties on a lot of stuff. You worked with them on a lot of stuff as well. Did you were living with Ad Rock for a certain amount of time?
Well, what happened was, and I wonder if we should make a little bit more of the stuff clear in case people don't really know who some of these people are. I keep forgetting time has passed. And whenever I'm in front of teenagers, they just have this blank look on their face, and then you realize, okay, maybe you need to put this stuff in context for people. I met the Beastie Boys in 1982, maybe, when this is even before they had a record deal with Def Jam in '86, and they were a punk rock band.
John Barry, rest in
peace. Coincidentally, an old friend of ours, one of the founding members of the Beastie Boys, John Barry, just passed away, and So it was a really different time, and we would hang out at CBGB's and Danceteria and a bunch of the local clubs in the area. And I was trying to get into the club, but back then, this was during the Velvet Rope era, and you had to know somebody in order to get in. You had to look a certain way, and they were local kids from the neighborhood, so they could easily get in even though they were underage. And I was from Jamaica, Queens, and I probably didn't look much different than I do now. But I was like a hip hop kid, and I was trying to get in the club, and they knew who I was because I had made a name for myself in the graffiti community. And coincidentally, Dave Skilkin, who we were talking about, another rest in peace, Dave was a graffiti artist and then later became a visual artist, and he did a lot of the album cover artwork for A Tribe Called Quest. But this is way before that, and he got into graphic design because he met me. But at this time, Dave was the one who told Adam who I was, and he was like, "Oh, you guys
we've seen you up,
getting me in the club," and they, just whisked me right on in the club, and it really changed my life because before then I was just going to roller skating rinks in Queens, and I had never really been to a Manhattan nightclub, and this is where adults hung out. And so, being a kid, you're kind of hanging out in this place where God knows what's going on. You're just happy to be a fly on the wall.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so hanging out in the club scene more and more, and we're talking about, the club kind of starting at 11 o'clock at night, and you just hang out until it closes at like 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and then you go out to breakfast, and before you know it, the sun is coming up. So after doing that night after night after night, my parents were like kind of wondering,
what's going on?
Yeah, what's going on? And I just started hanging out so much that I would crash at his house, and little by little, I ended up, getting one beef with my dad. I'm like, "Hey, I'm out of here. I'm going downtown," and I ended up just kind of hanging out at Adam's house to the point where I just had residency there.
I mean, that's the egg throwing days, and the egg raids and all of that as well. I only knew of Dave Skilkin as the trim coordinator, and that's the only thing I knew him as. And then when I was researching you, and I was looking through some of my old album covers, and I found this. Hold on here, let me. This is where we get to the good stuff here. I found this album cover right here, and it was done by his good friend Dave Skilkin. And I looked at it because I was honestly looking like, man, well, I wonder if Cey did this joint. You know what I'm saying? Like, I was just going through everyone like, I wonder if Cey did this joint. So when I saw Dave Skilkin's name, it kind of brought it all together for me. That, like, this was actually, for lack of a better term, a crew.
Yeah, but again, I think a lot of what was happening is that everybody's talented in some way, shape, or form. And Dave was always an artist. He just didn't know what he was going to do with his creative energy. And once I started designing for Def Jam, I think he figured out, okay, maybe this is something that I could do as well. And hanging out downtown, there's so many opportunities. And that was a situation where there was an opportunity presented because the guys from Tribe kind of hung in our circle as well, and I think they were instrumental in getting him connected with Jive Records, and he got the opportunity based on that.
You went up and kissed a little butt to Barry Weiss or whatever, right?
I don't think it was even that difficult. I think it was more like, oh, yeah, okay, you want to do that. And you got to remember, when you're talking about graphic design, and this is what I was saying before, this was a lane that nobody else was in line for. You didn't have any competition. When I started designing at Def Jam, it wasn't like there were 15 people trying to get that gig. Nobody cared. Like, what's graphic design? You go outside right now and you ask a young person, they know that term. But back then, this is an industry term. Like, graphic design was something that, creative professionals did. This wasn't something that kids aspired to do. It was technical. You had to learn a skill and a craft. It was very, very difficult.
It was Madison Avenue were the only people that were even hip to what the term was.
Yeah.
Now everybody with a MacBook is a graphic designer.
I mean, the closest thing that I can even think about is if anybody's watched any of Mad Men. Like that stuff that went on in the creative department. That's what it was like back then. It was completely off most people's radar.
Yeah. Well, you definitely revolutionized the game for the genre and for the culture. I want to bring up another thing. I know that hip hop, with the elements being, it can be argued, but graffiti being one of the elements. One of the interesting things to me about graffiti, and that sets it apart from the other parts of the element, is that it's not just exclusively tied to hip hop or to urban music. When I think about graffiti, some of the graffiti artists, I mean, even like Futura, like whoever, like some of these guys were like, not like necessarily, I mean, Futura was, but some of the people that I've looked at and grew up looking at as part of hip hop's culture were actually like metalheads and whatnot.
Well, again,
punk rock.
If you think about the late 70s, there is no hip hop. There's disco. So that's why you have this argument with graffiti purists that that graffiti is not a part of hip hop because it predates hip hop. It was there before, like in the 70s when we were writing graffiti, we were listening to disco or listening to rock and roll or, whatever the contemporary music was on the radio. There was nothing else. And it's the same thing with Flash and those guys. They didn't have the stuff that influenced them were breakbeat records. And like those jazz riffs and things like that. It's only later that people got this idea that hip hop has to be this one sort of thing, and they're gonna decide what it is and what it is not. But more times than not, the people that are saying that weren't really there. Because if you were there, you'd know that a lot of the stuff goes without, explaining. In the 70s, there was no hip hop. There might have been a couple of singles in 79, but if you were writing graffiti in 1976, you definitely weren't listening to rap records.
Right. Yeah, that's very right. Moving on to some of the classic Def Jam stuff you have, I want you to pull out your book there. You have your book. And we can show the difference here. This is actually a reprint. Public Enemy, Fear of a Black Planet, which I consider to be the ultimate Public Enemy record. A lot of people would argue that it takes a nation of millions, but I feel like this was to me, was revolutionary in the sense that there was so much turbulence going on and turmoil within the group that they were actually able to bring it in even tighter and make it even better, what I think was an end-to-end listening experience. But we were talking about this, one of the problems that labels have is, this looks great maybe from like right here, but when you get up close and you want to see the real deal, show them the real deal.
Well, the other thing too is you have nothing to compare it to. Just to kind of put it in focus a little bit, this is a book that I published. I have such a hard time saying that because I always think design. Called Definition, the Art and Design of Hip Hop. So this book is a sort of overview of the history of the visual art of hip hop, not the music, everything but the music. So this is all of the people that work behind the scenes. I wanted to say that page.
Yeah, I got you.
So these are all of the folks that were working behind the scenes in the name of the visual art of hip hop. And so I published this with the good folks at HarperCollins. And I say that because I'm not somebody that ever thought I would be able to publish a book. And I honestly didn't even think my story had value. And I just got tired of complaining about all these articles about rappers, and nobody talks about, the creative aspect as it relates to the visual art. And then one day somebody said to me, well, why don't you write your own book? And I was like, okay. And it wasn't even a concept. And we went knocking on the door, myself and Bill Adler, who wrote the essays along with a bunch of other talented writers that wrote for a lot of the famous hip-hop magazines. And he was the publicist at Def Jam, so we've known each other for a very, very long time. And HarperCollins gave us a deal, and they gave us a really great advance, and then we could take that money and pay the artist to be in the book because, as you know, if anybody out there has ever published a book, you know the misconception that you get rich off a book is crazy. But it's the best business card you ever want to have. And so that's the way I thought about it. It was a business card for what it is we do. And there's a beautiful illustration on the front cover by Mike Thompson of Little Kim. And I have to mention this while I have the opportunity. We got a lot of flack from public schools for this cover because they said it was sexist, it was, misogynistic towards women, all this stuff. And I definitely see that and understand it. But what people don't know is that the editor of HarperCollins picked that, and she's a woman, and her whole staff is female. I gave them two options, that and the Tupac image, and they says, oh no, Tupac's too controversial. And it's like, he's dead. How did he be controversial? So I had to go to Afeni Shakur to get permission to use the Tupac image, and it's inside the book. But Little Kim ended up being on the cover. And she had to give a blessing too. And I was like, she posed for that. And, as a guy, I catch all this heat. But believe me, I'm sensitive to the issue. But for the record, female. And so, let me just take this off because it always just gets from my So, this is the illustration, the original illustration for Fear of a Black Planet that was done by a painter named B.E. Johnson that did paintings for NASA. And so Chuck D from Public Enemy had this idea about Fear of a Black Planet. And so he scribbles down a little sketch on a napkin with a Sharpie and just explains that it's going to be a black planet eclipsing the Earth. And he hands it to me and my partner, Steve Carr, and is like, okay, you guys figure it out. And that was the extent of the creative direction that we got. And our idea was we were going to hire an illustrator that understood space and time. And we got B.E. Johnson. And I think he did a fabulous job. Where's that record cover? I'll hold up the record cover if you hold that.
All right.
And so...
Chinatown.
And so, it still may be difficult to see the difference, but... the color is so rich there, and this is kind of, washed out because it was probably reproduced from a CD or something like that. But making this record was a real treat because Chuck D is such a visionary, and luckily I don't have to explain how great he is to you guys. But he gave us so much freedom to do what we do best, and he wasn't a micromanager, and he still isn't. But what was really cool about making this record was it was the first time we got to do a conceptual album cover where it wasn't just a picture of a band on the front. And so my partner and I had this idea that we wanted to elevate the art form to the level of rock and roll album covers because, Pink Side, Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, and Led Zeppelin, and the Doors, and the Beatles, they all had these amazing conceptual album covers. But when it came to R&B and hip-hop, it was always somebody standing in front of a brick wall with a leather jacket on, or somebody with their arms folded, giving you an ice grill so you know that they're down. And, I get all of that, but my thing was, I want to make another What's Going On. I want to do a hip-hop version of something like that, so when we step back, we can look at it and still be proud. And I was really happy that I found an artist that understood that vision and was right there with me. And Chuck was that guy. And so getting an opportunity to make something like this was really cool. And I don't have a reference of this, but hopefully you guys are familiar with the record. Paulina is wearing the B.I.G. Ready to Die artwork, and that's another artist whose cover I worked on, Notorious B.I.G. Oh my goodness! Wow, you really gonna make me start crying up here because I haven't seen that in a long time.
This is the breaks version right here.
Wow!
I had them paired together as for.
Oh my goodness!
But that's the original.
So this is a record that I made for Puff and Bad Boy, and this is another record that I'm really proud of because it's another conceptual album cover. for Notorious B.I.G. And the thing that was so cool about this was Puff just said, this is the name of the record, and that image has to be on the front. Do what you want. And he didn't actually say do what you want, but he implied it.
Was he inspired by Nas?
No, we never thought about that. That was not even a question. And it's funny because people put those two things together today when you think about Illmatic and this, and they did come out at the same time. But that's the other thing, they came out at the same time.
Illmatic came out before this, though. I'm just going, technically.
But this is Puff's
I'm not going on Ghostface or nothing.
Right.
But,
And I just thought it was such a strange thing at the time because I'm like, okay, he's a baby. Like, how can a baby be ready to die? It's just weird.
Can I ask you something else about this? This is the album, obviously, but they released several 12 inches off of the record as well. And with the 12 inches, it seems like you juxtaposed the image of the lettering, because the lettering here is so small and just very simple and clean.
Well, we went back and forth. So if anybody has the records, we went back and forth from the image being small to the image being large, the type being small here, the type being large. We were doing a play on positive and negative. And so that's why if you have all those singles, you look at them, we just went back and forth a bunch of different times, just playing with the shape and the size because of the term big. So we were thinking about big, small, big, small. So you're the first person that ever asked that.
I did a little research. I was going to say too, if you want to expound upon.
Was it in a sleeve?
Trust me, everything's been through the ringer.
I haven't seen this in a very.
That's the promo copy too. The actually, Grandmaster Flash offered me $100 for my copy of No Money, No Problems, the 12 inch. I wish I would have sold it to him.
So what that one there is the reissue?
No, this isn't actually the reissue. This is the breaks that were made to use the album.
Oh, and the thing that I was saying about album art, they probably printed this from this because they, the printers went out of business. They couldn't find the film. They did not think to call me. And you can tell on the back too when you look at it. And so this is all just, design nitpicking to some degree. But if that's all you do, that's all you care about. And I always want to make sure that it looks as great as it can look. But when they call that second time around, then you don't really have the benefit of, holding them to task because most of the time they've never seen this. They just know that they have to make this. It's funny, I recently, a couple of weeks ago, I got a call from, I don't even know what the label is now. What label is Maroon 5 on?
They were on J.
I knew that, but I don't know what label they're on now.
I have no idea.
Well, maybe it's like BMG or Sony or something. But they called me. I did the first Maroon 5 record, Songs About Jane, and they want to reissue that on multi-vinyl with all of these bells and whistles, and they wanted the original artwork. And I was like,
somebody's on top of their job there. Whoever that guy is, recommend him.
Yeah, I'm sure Adam was behind it. But it's that kind of thing where it's nice when they pay attention to detail and they're smart enough to know what door to knock on as opposed to just kind of making it on their own and thinking that the audience isn't going to know the difference because they do.
Absolutely. I mean, you can tell the difference. It's like night and day
when you see them together.
Yeah, and it's important that I'm calling every label person that I know and be like, if you don't call for the original files, I can't mess with you. Why don't you talk about how you ended up working with Big, how you went from being part of the Def Jam family to working with Bad Boy and all of that?
Well, and this is where this stuff can get really boring and technical. Forgive me because I can't gauge how much of this stuff is really important and how much of it is just, ridiculous circumstance. So I'll try to be as brief as I can about this because I don't want to put you guys to sleep. There was a rap group called Jekyll and Hyde that had a guy named Andre Harrell and Alonzo Brown. They were like a rap duo that were kind of like the suit and tie rappers. And so this is like late 70s, early 80s. Andre, anybody by show of hands seen the movie Crush Groove?
You know Andre.
Really?
Yeah, she does.
So Andre was in the movie Crush Groove. There's a scene where LL Cool J is about to go on, and Andre's group was called Jekyll and Hyde, and they were supposed to be the headliners, and LL was the opening act. And LL crushes the stage, and they had to follow him. And needless to say, they did not do very well because they were supposed to be the Wall Street rappers. And Andre and Alonzo realized at that point that, you know, there was a passing of the baton and their career was over right at that moment. And so they decided that they were going to work behind the scenes, and Andre was going to become an executive. So he was working with Russell Simmons at Def Jam, and then lo and behold, like a lot of people, he got his own deal to have his own label, and he went and started Uptown Records. And Uptown Records is the label that originally brought you a guy named Father MC and Jodeci and Heavy D and the Boys, and then later Mary J. Blige. So at this time, Andre is now a music executive. And because we were a tight-knit family, we started doing a lot of the design for Uptown as well. And at this particular time, Heavy D was a huge star. And so I wanted to work with Heavy D like nobody's business because he was just, you know, he was heavy, he was the man. And so at this time, Puff is also Andre's intern, and so Puff is kind of in charge of the look and the aesthetics of all the bands that are on the Uptown roster, while Andre's kind of doing other things. Puff is sort of managing the store. And they said, well, you know, I was always pushing to work with Heavy D, and this is okay, you know what, we're gonna have you do the next Heavy record, but first you gotta do our Mary record. And I was like, Mary, I just want to work with Heavy D. You know, that was all I cared about, was Heavy D, Heavy D, Heavy D. So I'm bugging them.
From Yonkers, yo.
But you didn't know that yet. Right. And no one else did either. And so I met with Mary, and we talked about doing the design for this record called What's the 411. We did a little tiny photo shoot in a room that's like half the size of that room over there, if you can see it. Put up a white cyc, set it up, did these photos. I mean, the whole thing might have took like 4 hours. Puff comes in, looks at the styling. Okay, yeah, this is all great. Mary, you know, leaves. I said, okay, this is what I'm going to do for the logo design. She said, okay, great. You know, I did the script logo for Mary's record. I did all the handwriting on the back. What's the 411, if anybody has that record or CD. And did the whole thing in a couple of weeks, and we were done. And then I got an opportunity to work with Heavy D. And that was a star moment. I got to hang out with him. And he was from Mount Vernon, you know, the same place as Mary, so I imagine there was some synergy there. But it was a great opportunity to work with a really talented star, rest in peace. But they might have had a sense of how great Mary was going to be, but for me, my job was just to focus on working on the record. And I never tried to think about these people as superstars. It was just communicating whatever the visual message was as best I could, and that was my job. So I always tried to strip away all of that. And luckily, 99.9% of the time, none of these people had ever had a record out, so there was nothing to attach it to. So if they walked in the door feeling like they meant something or there was somebody, it was really more right here, because nobody knew who the hell any of them were. So that was always a benefit, because you didn't have that getting in the way. If you know anything about working with a real star, people that are really stars don't have to make you feel bad in order to make themselves shine. It's like their light is shining regardless. But working on those records, it was so great because they were open to collaboration. Unless you came and you had your own idea about what your logo was going to look like, what your styling was going to look like, where you wanted to take pictures as it relates to being on location if it wasn't in the studio, we were always open. But most of the time, people were just a blank slate. And they were like, just paint whatever picture you think works. And if it didn't work, somebody would say something. But more times than not, working with a team of talented creatives and marketing folks, we got it right. So I don't even know if I answered the question because I think you asked me something else.
Well, no, you basically just to sum up the synopsis of that was I was asking how did you get to work with Big basically, and what was the genesis of that?
I see, I didn't get all the way there. I stopped at Mary.
Get there.
See, this is exactly what I was talking about. And then there's a little bit of a time span there. So I don't even remember when was the 411 comes out. Is it 92 maybe?
92, yeah.
Anybody?
Yeah, 92.
And
91 maybe. No, 92.
And then Ready to Die comes out 94 maybe?
Yeah, 94.
So then there's 2 years later. And so at this time, okay, we're working with Uptown, and then Uptown gives birth to Puffy kind of leaving and going with Clive Davis to start Bad Boy Records. And Puff's like, hey, we want you to do the artwork for our label. We just got a deal. He says to Clive, this is Cey Adams and Steve Card. They're at the drawing board. This is going to be my in-house art department. Clive and Arista are like, whatever you do. Yeah, the less they have to do with the majors, the better they, are content. So we got to work with all the Bad Boy artists. And so you have to imagine we are working in the Def Jam offices, and we have a small staff of about 8 to 10 people. We are working with Def Jam, we are working with Bad Boy, we are working with Uptown, and we are working with a handful of other indie labels that I can't even remember now, unless you mention a hit record. So we're doing all this inside the Def Jam offices. That's how little people care about what we were doing. They let us set up a design studio, and we had complete creative freedom. We didn't know that Def Jam was going to end up, having a rival on the charts with Bad Boy. That's when they started to pay attention, when they saw both of these records starting to chart, and then they're like, oh, you're giving Mary and Puff and them all the good stuff. And I was like, we're using the same people to do everything. What are you talking about?
Well, hold on. I was going to say in the promotion game as well, it sounds like you guys are like the Steve Rifkin of the, on a certain level, because I do know from my experience of working with labels that as an intern, they would let me do whatever I wanted to do. And so finally, if I got a check from another label to promote a record,
right,
and that record charted on a Gavin or a CMJ, then all of a sudden it's a problem.
Yeah.
It wasn't a problem while I was just like making radio calls and and then our records are charted.
But also, like for us, it really was all love. I mean, you have to understand that all of these people are family. To this day, Puff is a great friend. Andre, Russell, Leo Cohen, Rick Rubin, like all of these people I still work with all the time. When I see them out at events and stuff, we talk and we chat, but like everybody, real life keeps us all very, very busy. And so it's just amazing that all of these people ended up being so important as it relates to the history of the culture, because you would have never imagined that so much talent would come out of a small little pocket in this little area in the city. So it really is kind of unbelievable. I still never.
I see what you did there.
I still never even got to the BIG thing. See,
there you go. Get to the BIG.
Really fast. So
unbelievable is a great segue.
I am going to work every day at Def Jam, and I live on a street called St. James Place. And there's a whole crew of cats that are dealing on my block. And at this point, I think to myself, I got my little Def Jam jacket. I got a team of people that work with me. I made it to the promised land. But every day, I got to walk past the corner to get
to the train,
to where I'm going, and I got to deal with these idiots that, were out there hustling. And sometimes they would be sitting on my stoop in my building because one of the guys in the junior mafia lived in my building, and Big lived 2 doors away. I lived at 234 St. James, and he lived 2 doors
so you're
away.
Between Gates and Fulton.
And and so I would see these guys every morning, every evening. And then one day, I'm in Midtown, and I'm on 57th Street near Carnegie Hall, and I'm like, oh my goodness, there's Tupac. And I was like, what's he doing with that guy from my neighborhood? And, that's when he was like the heavy-set dude that dealt from my neighborhood. I did not know he was a rapper. He did not know what it was I did other than see me with a Def Jam jacket. And we weren't friends, we weren't acquaintances. It was like, you give the head nod and you keep on getting up. And then when I saw him, I was like, this guy must be connected in some way. And then about a week later, I go into a meeting at Bad Boy, and Puff is like, I want you to work on my Biggie record. And, I come in and he's in the meeting. And I was like, that's that dude. He goes, you guys know each other? And I was like,
my neighbor.
And again, the record hadn't come out yet, so I got no way of knowing that this guy has 1 ounce of talent other than knowing that Puff is, the best talent scout in the business. So I imagined that, okay, maybe he's got some chops, but I didn't think, much of it. We made the record, that was the end of that, and I went on about my business. And you know what happened after that.
It's just amazing. You bring up Big and Pac. I was living in New York then, and to see those guys, you would see them out everywhere, just normally, hanging out. So when anybody tries to talk about the beef and all of that and what came, there's all the characters that surrounded them, the Haitian Jacks, the blacks and people like that were part of their different cliques and whatnot. But it was just a normal thing to see them together. Like I just remember my days in New York and always seeing them. We're going to take it back to the Beasties here for a second. I brought a little something here. And this to me is one of the most interesting album covers, especially with the time. And I want to talk to you about the process of how you created this album cover. This album cover.
You really brought out the big guns, man. Wow. Wow. Uncoated stock.
Nice.
Just to tag on to what you were saying about that, it really is unfortunate how much the media gets involved in a lot of this stuff because, like everybody, you know anything about hip-hop, you know that all these people are walking contradictions. And none of them are politically correct 100% of the time. And it really is a shame that all of that stuff happened because at the end of the day, 2 really talented artists are gone, and that is the most important thing about all of that.
Absolutely. It's very sad.
This is not only one of my favorite records, but it was a lot of fun to make this. And just to kind of put this in context for you guys, what year has this come out? 98 maybe?
This is after communication, so yes.
Okay, so this comes out 1998. There's no legal line on that?
98.
There you go. Still got it. This comes out in 1998. I had known the Beastie Boys since...
Cookie Puss.
Yeah, so that's 81, 82, somewhere in there. I don't even know how many years that is, but if there's somebody really good at math here. 17 years, thank you. And we were fast friends. I met them that day that I told you that story, and we were joined at the hip ever since. When they went out on the License to Ill tour, it's 1986, Steve Carr and myself, we had formed the drawing board. I got to go out on the road with the band. I just took off. It was a 20-something-year-old kid, and the guys were like, hey, we're going out on tour. And Adam's like, we're going to LA, we're gonna do American Bandstand, we're gonna do Soul Train, we're gonna, just travel. And it was myself, it was Dave Skilkin, it was a photographer named Ricky Powell, 3 guys in the band. And it was a traveling circus. They brought their entourage the same way every black rap group brings their entourage. And the reason I mention that is because it was the first time I got to travel, the first time I got to go to Europe, Japan, Hawaii, the first time I did anything. And I got to see the whole world and have a salary. I had a young baby at the time, and I got to send money home to my parents. And, I thank God that they allowed me to go because, my baby's mother at the time could have shut it down and not let me go, but she was like, go. My parents were like, we got him, just go. And, it was a really cool thing. My son was born in 1984, so it was the early stages of when everything was bubbling, but, I'm still a stupid kid, transitioning from graffiti to doing this graphic design stuff, and I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to build my life. But the minute this happened, not this, License to Ill, I knew that it was something great, and it was the first time I got to experience what it feels like to really be alive. We were on television, we were in the news, and because I was an artist, I got to design all of their merchandise. If there was a stage backdrop, I got to do that. I got to art direct. Anything visual, they referred to me because that's what I did. And people just assume that if you stand up with authority and you present yourself like a professional, then maybe you know what you're talking about in spite of being so young. Now, we all understand that young people have power and they have influence and they are creative. But back then, people didn't assume that. And, like adults wanted to kind of put you in your place and test your knowledge. But thanks to people like the Beastie Boys and Run DMC, I got an opportunity to showcase what I was able to do without the obstacles of people sort of getting in my way. So what happened was after we did a lot of that stuff in the early 80s, I was busy with my Def Jam career and working with all the artists that they had and managing a firm, and I had this, staff and people with their own needs, and I had a family. I realized that the guys were good on their own. I didn't need to work on their records in order to earn a living. And they were very involved in every creative aspect, and I love these guys to death to this day, but they were my best friends, and so I knew that I didn't need to work with them, so I just kind of, unless they asked me, I stayed out of it. And after a bunch of years, Adam Yauk came back around, and Adam and they said, hey, we want you to work on this record with us. Not for us, with us. And that meant that they had a lot of creative ideas, but I had to help them turn it into graphic design in order for it to work on the record. And they were always big on kind of doing things themselves and not letting the label tell them how they were going to make their art. And that's really the best thing about working with an artist that has some commercial success, is that people don't get in your way. Whatever the band wants is going to happen. The best thing you can do is figure out how to help them realize that dream. And this is like a quick little sidebar. In the mid-90s, I was in the office working late one night, and I get a phone call from a music executive who's on the marketing side, and she's like, hey, Cey, I have a client who's also a friend, and he's looking for a black art director, and you were the only one that I know, and I wonder if you would be interested in this opportunity. And I'd worked with everybody up to that point, so I don't need another album design job, so I'm kind of like, And I says, well, who's your client? And she says, Stevie Wonder. And immediately, all my little, rock star potential just sucked out of the phone. And I just turned into a 12-year-old kid. And she puts me on the phone with his manager, and we start talking. And he's like, We did a little bit of research. We really like your stuff. Stevie wants to talk to you. Is it okay if I give him your number? You know, and I'm married at the time, and I was on my way home, and I said, sure. I go home, and you know, maybe 30 minutes after I get there, the phone rings, and it's Stevie's manager again. He's like, hey, Cey, it is. I'm gonna put you on with Stevie. And he puts me on the phone with Stevie Wonder, and I could feel my hands sweating as I'm holding the telephone. And the minute I walked in the door, I told my wife, because that's how excited I was, and we were on our way to my parents' house in Queens, and I get on the phone, and this is that kind of thing where, you know, we had landlines, and she, you know how you would pick the phone up really carefully so the other person couldn't hear. And now that I think about it, because he's Stevie Wonder, he probably could hear that. And she's listening on the other line, and I'm talking to him, and it was really the closest thing to feeling like I was talking to somebody that really impacted my life. And, you know, working with rappers is a great thing, don't get me wrong. All of these people is really great, but I never worked with a superstar. These people are all ground zero. Talking to Stevie Wonder was like, you're talking to Stevie Wonder.
Stevie Wonder, bro.
And I'm gonna end this part of it here because it ends up going on, and there's a longer version of this story. That's actually pretty funny. But we get off the phone after talking for a couple of minutes, and I'm literally like not even in shape to drive. So my wife has to drive at that point. And we go to my folks' house, and I tell this story, and everybody, then all of a sudden, I'm doing something. Before that, I'm just like, working around. Yeah. Because, my parents, they loved Adam and those guys, and Ron and everybody, but you say Stevie Wonder, and then it resonates with my older sister and my younger sister. Everybody's like, now you're doing
all those artists that you worked with before that were all brand new artists. Yeah, there was no preconceived notion.
Yeah, and also like my sister was 10 years older. My parents are older. To my mom it was like that hip hop boom 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 music. But when you say Stevie Wonder, it clears the playing field.
It absolutely does. It brings you. I mean, it had to bring you just to a revelation in your own career in life.
Well, I never really felt like I had arrived. That moment was like, wow. And it also, sadly, I realized how narrow the playing field was. I didn't have any contemporaries. And that kind of bummed me out that I got the gig, sadly, almost by default, because there's nobody else out there. And I'm not saying I'm the only one, but there wasn't a lot of people to choose from. And luckily, I knew somebody that knew him.
I don't know how much luck had to do with it.
Well, yeah, maybe not.
Here, you wanna hold this, and I'll
sure.
Hold the microphone.
So anyway, like I said, fast forward to 97 when we started to make this record, and the guys said, "Hey, we want to collaborate on this record," and we sat down for what felt like a couple of weeks, and we just kicked around a bunch of different ideas, and we just got to make another concept album, but the guys got to do whatever it was they wanted to do, and so we got to dream this sort of amazing dream. And at this time, I had an amazing team of illustrators and graphic designers working under me. So a lot of this was done by an artist named Bill McMullen, who was just a whiz. And also he was a hardcore Beasties nerd and fanatic. And so a lot of the people that came to work for me were real fans of the culture. When I started, I wasn't fans of anybody because there was nobody there. Over time, these people came to work with us with the sole intention of working with these bands. And so giving them that opportunity was a great thing. And these are people that would stay up day and night to get this stuff done on deadline because they care that much about the music. And when you're doing this sort of work, there is no clock.
There's no clock.
You're in it. Nobody cares whether you're eating, whether you're sleeping, whether you got children to take care of at home. It's about getting that product done. And when I say that, I don't mean the bands. I'm just talking about the machine. So this was just a great, great record because we got to do cool vinyl and this is just, oh my goodness, I'm so excited even to see that you have this. I have, copies of this at home, but I never look at them.
Talk about the tin can.
The concept was, I guess they have a line in the song, "Trapped like sardine, in a can," and the guys wanted to make this look as authentic as possible. And this is even, Photoshop is around, but they were clear that they didn't want it to be this sort of Photoshop thing. They wanted it to look like they were really in a tin can. So we had the photographer hire a construction crew, and we built a live model giant tin can, and the boys got inside it and took a photograph, and then we kind of superimposed this part so it was a real can. And so we went down to Little Italy and got all these vintage cans of sardines and blended the two things together and did a photo composite, so they were really in a real sardine can. And that's why it looks so authentic. And if anybody's familiar with this record, the guys were kind of clowning around while we were setting up the lights. And I just told the photographer, Michael Levine, just keep shooting, keep shooting, keep shooting. And this was one of the shots that was originally an outtake. And, they were kind of clowning around. Mike D is making this stupid face. And Yauk and Adam are both laughing. And the boys in the band decided to use that as the cover. And I just thought it was really cool because if you know anything about giving people options, never give them the option that you want them to pick. Because they'll always pick the first one or the third one if you want that second one. But the Beastie Boys are very unique in that regard. If you want them to go with that one that really makes sense, they're usually into that. And this is such a goofy cover, and the fact that we got to make it was a big deal because, there were shots where they were all trying to look serious or they were all trying to look funny, and this was just one of those opportunities where we sort of nailed it, and we got to realize it in its perfect form, and that just does not happen often.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's totally brilliant. We do got to kind of keep it moving here.
I know, it's so sad. This is exactly what I was talking about. You could just ramble forever about this stuff because it's history, and it's American history, and it's our history, and we all kind of share in this stuff. And I'm fortunate that I have some of these stories, but this stuff kind of belongs to everybody because everybody grew up with this music. So I'm just happy that people are listening, and I hope, like I said before, some of this stuff resonates because it means a lot to me because these are my boys.
I mean, that's very real. I'm going to give you one thing here. I'm going to show you one other thing, and then we're going to take some questions. Okay. I spoke to you earlier about my work with a kid named Rhymefest,
right.
And I was speaking with Mark Ronson a couple days ago. And what's funny is, I'll tell you a brief aside to this. While we were working on the Rhymefest record, we were down in the village on like 6th Avenue, 4th Street, right around that area. There's a little brunch spot, breakfast type spot. And we were having brunch, and over my back shoulder was Ad Rock. And Mark Ronson Mark couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. And I was like, what's going on back here? What's the deal? And he was like, oh my God, he goes, Ad Rock is right behind you. Ad Rock's right behind you. I'm like, Ad Rock's right behind me. So then I'm like, we're both basically Beastie Boy super groupies. I mean, we're fans for life. I mean, we always have been. I actually toured with them. And when I said toured with them, not like how you did. I was actually just following them from city to city and state to state. And I got on their nerves so bad that Ricky Powell was like, all right, if you show up at the next stop, I'll put you on the list. And then you just got to chill out a little bit, man. You got to chill out. I was like, all right. So he would actually put me on the list for each show through the Midwest and make sure this was like the check your head time.
Yeah.
And so I was such a fan that when Mark saw him, he knew how big of a fan that I was. And he was just like, he's right behind you, he's right behind you. And I'm like, and we're talking about like our own thing and our own label and blah, blah, blah. And he was telling me about a guy that was helping design the logo. And I brought this T-shirt out here.
I just want you to know, when I get home, I'll tell Adam that story.
Please do. I mean, because it's very serious.
Wow.
So, and as you can see, it has the, some might think mid colors, but maybe more men's colors. I don't know.
And
this is a logo that you did.
Do you know what that references?
Of course, Stevie.
All I do, Stevie Wonder. Mark Ronson is the biggest Stevie Wonder fan, and all I do is a Stevie Wonder song. And and that's one of the things too. Like when I told Adam and those guys about that Stevie Wonder story, they were so jealous because everybody wants to meet Stevie Wonder. And I was fortunate enough to not only talk to him, but to go to LA and meet him and work with him. And people like Mark, still to this day, like, he might have met him at this point because, Mark's a big star in his own right. But it's really cool.
He didn't really know him. He didn't know Stevie at this point. Really.
No, I know he didn't, but I'm sure he does now.
Oh, he does.
And for those of you who don't know, Mark Ronson is an amazing singer-songwriter and most notably producer. And I guess everybody knows from the Bruno Mars song now, right? But he also produced a lot of the tracks on the Amy Winehouse record. And so Mark has been an old buddy from back in the day, and I just love the synergy with all of this stuff. It's like,
well, it's amazing because I was like, didn't he? Because I remember him telling me, he was like, oh, the guy who's going to do our logo is the guy that did all the Def Jam stuff. He's amazing. His company's amazing. They're going to make our logo and blah blah blah. And I was just like, I can't wait. Let's see what he comes up with. And he came up with this, and I thought it was amazing. I don't even know if you ever got one of these T-shirts. You can have this one. I have an extra one, and trust me, it's clean, but it's old. And all right, I don't care. If you never got one, I want you to have one because it does signify a certain time. It was like right before the digital revolution and whatnot. But Mark had signed my artist Rhymefest to a deal, and then we went on to sign with J Records, and I had the luxury and the fortune to actually sit down in meetings with Clive Davis. I mean, it was one of those things where when we were going through the deal that Clive's going to be here today, and he wasn't there. Clive's going to be here today, and he wasn't there. Clive's going to be here today. By the sixth time, I was like, whatever, man, he ain't going to be there.
And then he rolls up.
And then he rolls in. It's like, oh, Clive Davis is here, Right. And this is the very beginning of the American Idol. Okay, so it was like, his whole thing was accessibility and also artistic integrity, and he trying to find a balance between the two. It was just an honor to work with him. But I want to open this up because I know some of you might have some questions or anything. So if anybody wants to just raise your hand. President.
Okay, so I'm a fan of Beastie Boys, pretty heavy. And what's up with the thing in Hornblower? You got any insight on what that character's about, or like why he made him up, or any of that?
I probably don't have anything that I can share with you that you can't find online. Like, it's Adam Yauch. I mean, Yauch was a very brilliant artist, and he was a creative individual, and all of that stuff was kind of just born out of his head. But,
much like you. Go ahead. What's your question?
Where do you get your inspiration?
Just trying to stay busy. Being a graffiti artist, for me, I was always trying to prove to people that the work that we did was valid. So I'm always just looking at things. And now I get a lot of inspiration from younger artists because I recognize that, some of them have had benefits from some of the work that myself and my friends have done. So, I scan the internet sometimes, just looking for really cool stuff. And now you got all these websites where people can post things. And so I keep folders for inspiration just to kind of see what's going on out there. So just really all over the internet, really.
Go ahead.
I was wondering if you could comment a little on the impact on your industry with going with digital music and, with vinyl seeming to now it's making a comeback, but in terms of the artwork for going along with
You know what? I honestly think it's almost non-existent. But because I don't buy a lot of music outside of iTunes, I don't even know. I buy records that I'm already somewhat familiar with, and you get an album cover that's this big, the end. That's the end of it. It's really kind of sad because if that visual art is living somewhere out there, or maybe you go to Urban Outfitters and you see a 12-inch. That's the only time I really come in contact with it. But I don't really follow it that much, and I don't buy a lot of music. And it's one of the things that really makes me sad because I think the newer generation don't understand how much they're being cheated. Because when you had an album, that's an experience. To touch it, to feel it, to talk about the quality, to read the liner notes. I was talking about this the other day. You can't, lounge on the internet. There's just too much stuff moving around. You click a button and then you don't remember where you were, or you can't remember where you were going, and then all of a sudden you get distracted and you're on Facebook and then you're on Instagram.
God,
how do you have an organic experience with artwork? You can't. So,
how do you think the graffiti world is going to shape going forward, knowing how it has evolved over time and how people have been able to connect with it in the past, but going forward with this digital age, how do you think things?
The one thing I will say about the future is that nobody knows. It's a fact. If I knew 30 years ago what I know today, I would have held on to everything that everybody gave me. Jean-Michel was a horse I would have not thought he would come in first. And he was a buddy of mine. I'm just saying, I assume you know Jean-Michel Basquiat is. It's just, there's no way to know. But the one thing I will say is it makes me pay attention more. Because the thing that I've learned from hip-hop is you can never tell where a hit is going to come from. I had an opportunity to work with a friend's band, and she's like, oh, they're a little startup band. And I was like, oh, I want to work with bands. I worked with so many rappers. And she says, oh, they're just starting out. This is Adam, this is Jesse. They have a band called Maroon 5. And I worked on that first record, Songs About Jane. I would have never guessed that those guys that were hanging out in my living room for 2 years working on that record would have been Maroon 5. And, I was like, I got enough Adams in my life. I don't need one more Adam. And, in the Beastie Boys crew, we had a guy named Adam Tracy, and then Adam Yauk and Adam Horowitz, and my last name is Adams. I was like, I got plenty of them. So, to answer your question, I don't know. I don't buy a lot of digital music. I listen to Spotify and some of the others the way a lot of other people do. But, to be honest with you, I'm not really in the music business. I'm a visual artist. I'm in the business of making art. And I try to always make that distinction whenever possible. I listen to music to get inspiration when I'm working on a record. But, there's just so much stuff out there. There's just no way to know. I hope that answers your question.
You talked about your inspiration being pop artists like Stein and Warhol, but I wondered who are your favorite contemporary artists?
Wow, that is a really good question. Well, one of them is my buddy Derek Adams, who is
another Adam.
Another Adams. We share the same last name. So Derek is one of my favorite artists coming up right now. There are a lot, and it's embarrassing that I can't spew off like a half a dozen names because I get so caught up with my graffiti and street art friends. There's a young woman named Mad C out of Europe who, oh my goodness, she is like the ultimate beast. You want to talk about somebody that could slay 1,000 artists with one stroke of her hand. Google this woman, Mad C. Her name is Claudia, and she has taken the best of everybody from the 80s and other contemporaries, and she is absolutely brilliant. I never saw such a tiny person do such amazing work.
Other than Paulina.
Well, I told Paulina she's her size,
Yeah.
and this woman is just, she's brilliant. So Mad C is one of my favorite artists. And then, there's a lot of my friends from the 80s that are doing really great work now. And that's the other thing that I really want to mention, is that a lot of these people are brilliant artists, and I love Jean-Michel and Keith Haring to death. But there's so many other artists that came alongside them that are doing great work that can use some of that shine. Banksy, nothing against him. Talented guy, share the wealth. There's just so many great people. Why does, one person have to, just suck up all the air? And I know it's not his fault, but that's the way the machine works. When something's hot, people want to throw more coals on the fire. No, that guy's got a crew of people whose work you should be looking at.
I was going to, as an aside to Banksy, I was going to recommend a guy named Smug from Glasgow, Scotland. I think that he's an amazing artist as well. It doesn't quite get the...
Right. Yeah, and I know his work from when, I was on tour with the guys and we were in Glasgow. And so, like I said before, always kind of being on the lookout for talent. That's one of those things that traveling does afford you. You get to meet all these amazing people and you realize that, you have a shared history.
Did anybody give you a Glasgow kiss? Just say no to it if anybody offers it. What's your question?
Outfits, I'm a fashion designer. I kind of want to know, how did you transition from graffiti and album covers to fashion? What you did is Run DMC as well.
I appreciate that you even know that, because it's not something that I think about a lot. You know what? It wasn't even so much that I transitioned. It's the same thing that I just said. Opportunities present opportunities. And all of those things were somebody seeing me. I worked with Adidas in '86 when Run DMC was working with them. And then fast forward to present day, I was in Berlin with the Beastie Boys, and the folks from Adidas had approached them, and the guy overheard me saying something, and he's like, "Hey, Sam, I heard your name. We've been trying to get a hold of you, and we want to commission you to do a line of clothing." I wasn't seeking it out. It kind of just was there. But it was my history that presented the opportunity. And then the following year, they came back and they said, "Oh, we want you to work with Muhammad Ali this year." But a lot of those things are born out of my relationships with other people. And when Russell Simmons started Fat Farm, I was just there and got an opportunity to work with Fat Farm. And then because, I was working with Jay-Z when they did Rockaware, I got an opportunity to do some of the early design with Rockaware. But a lot of that stuff doesn't show up, in the scorecards because of all this other stuff that just gets so much attention. And the fact that I didn't completely transition and become a fashion designer, a lot of it just falls by the wayside. And then the same thing when Pop says, "Hey, I'm starting a fashion line, and I'm gonna call Sean John, and I need a logo, and I need you to design, a stack of, t-shirt designs." I did all of that stuff for all of those labels, but because my passion was never fashion, it never really stuck. And then you have all these other people that are coming along that are passionate, and then you can just kind of hand them the ball. So I hope that answers your question. I am grateful for the opportunity, and now I can kind of string together all of those things, and I can show a breadth of work from the early days till now. But I always thought that stuff was for people that were much more talented than I was. And I was telling Paulina this story about doing the only real fashion design that I did in the early '80s in a nightclub in 1983. And luckily there was a photographer there to document it, and recently I got to see all those photographs. And I'm gonna post one of them on Facebook because I wanna see them and I want other people to see them, but I first have to get permission from the photographer because, I try to be mindful of that, especially if you consider, had it not been for her documenting it, I wouldn't even have record of it. And Lord knows I can't remember all of those things all these years later. But a lot of that really is just opportunities that are kind of floating around, and everybody's got some sort of passion, and sometimes they just kind of want to hitch their wagon to something related to hip hop, and I get a lot of that, so I'm grateful for it.
We have to wrap this up. I'm sorry, you guys. I know you want to keep this guy here all night answering.
We got one. I think we just had one more question.
Okay. One last one, because we have to be out of here basically.
At 9.
9.
Yeah.
So if you can help us put the chairs away.
I got you. You got my full support.
And now we can go outside and keep talking.
Parking lot.
Sure.
Where's the other
It's
question?
very nice outside.
Right there.
My name's Anne, and I'm actually an artist as well, and I just studied graphic design at Indy University. Now, originally, I'm like a portraiture type person, and realism, and so like being in a studio art class, I can get a lot of attention. Whereas when I'm in my graphic design class, and like even 10 people, there's a lot of competition with like critique and just I don't know. I guess my question is, how would you suggest standing out as an artist, especially with graphic design nowadays, now that there's so much more competition?
Again, really good question. And, to me, I think developing a signature style is very, very important. And I'm a fan of having a hero and having, something to aspire to. And, I tell my son this a lot too, because he wants to be, no, I shouldn't say wants to be, he's a tattoo artist. And I want him to be the greatest. And so I just always tell him, find somebody whose work you really love and try to make your work as strong as that. Not necessarily emulate it, but I think that'll be the thing. And then time, I think, weeds out all the fakes. Over time, you stay the course, you will watch everybody alongside you drop off, their interests will shift. The same way I was talking about fashion, I'm one of those people as it relates to fashion. My interest was never there, so I fell by the wayside, and all these other people got opportunities. So I think the best thing you can do is develop a signature style and really just stay passionate to what you're doing. And over time, you will see a lot of those other people will really just fall by the wayside.
Thank you guys so much. That does it. Also, he never did say the name of his crew or his company. It's the Drawing Board.
But that was
Is that a given?
Well, no, but that was a long time ago.
I know, but that's a big, like you can look on almost any back of any album, and it's like the Drawing Board.
When my partner Steve Carr moved to Hollywood and became a film director, we also spun off our company and had a film division called Drawing Board Pictures, and so we got to make a lot of the early music videos. So if you ever saw any of those early Jay-Z videos, Steve did all of those. And then he parlayed that into an opportunity to do a film called Next Friday. With,
Ice Cube.
Ice Cube. I knew that. I was just and then he got an opportunity to work with Eddie Murphy and did Dr. Dolittle, and then Daddy Daycare, and then Rebound with Martin Lawrence, and then Paul Blart Mall Cop. That was very good. Wow. You should be proud of me. I have to do that because he swears that I never mentioned his name. So you guys have all witnessed that I do. But to answer your question, we started a film division, and from that, Steve moved to Hollywood and became an A-list film director, along with another person that came out of Def Jam named Brett Ratner, who did all the Rush Hour films. And so it's that thing that I was saying before about staying the course, and they were committed to being filmmakers, and that's what they ended up doing. And over a period of time, they became great because they perfected their crafts.